Chapter 8, Act 8, The Engineer's Tale. Act 8, The Engineer's Tale. The Silent Scream.
NNNGH.
Luca clenched her jaw, fighting through the agony of the inflamed nerves in her arm to turn Rydia over so that she could get some air. A pale pink starburst-shaped scar had materialized on Rydia's chest, and Luca realized that it must have been the exit wound created by the lightning as it shot through her back. Luca brushed back Rydia's ratty hair that had fallen over her face, and saw her eyelids fluttering rapidly, like she was trapped in a nightmare.
Rydia. You all right?
Rydia twitched at the sound of Luca's voice, and slowly, her eyes began to slide open, her dilated pupils constricting as the light from the skull torches above hit them.
Luca. What happened to the crystal?
Lucas looked away.
I'm sorry, Rydia. I couldn't stop her.
Rydia bit down on her lower lip and sat up, feeling like her head had transformed into a spinning top. Her now empty hands brushed over the exit wound on her chest, the skin surprisingly smooth and still warm with the buzzing electricity that had burned her from within. She knew it was too late for regrets. The past had repeated itself once again, and she had willingly ignored every warning sign thrown at them, but she still couldn't help but wished she had the power to turn back time, even if only for a few precious minutes. Rydia lowered her eyes. But if we had just left the crystal alone, that woman would have forced her way through anyway and decimated the demon wall. It wasn't like she didn't have the power to do so, especially if she can summon eidolons. Rydia accepted the uncomfortable realization that perhaps their efforts were meant to delay the inevitable, and now they had little time to make their next move.
Did I hear her correctly while I was out of it?
Rydia asked quietly.
Did she say the 4 dark crystals were in our hands?
Luca nodded.
Yes. But I wonder who R is? Who could she be possibly working with?
Rydia shook her head. The Red Wings were the only clue they had. And it wasn't exactly the answer she wanted. Perhaps another uncomfortable truth was on the horizon.
We need to hurry. Before they get their hands on the overworld crystals, too.
Luca stood up, offering her hand to Rydia. Rydia grabbed on and let Luca yank her to her feet. As she checked herself for other injuries, Luca approached the 2 dolls, which were unmoving, both pairs of glass eyes staring listlessly ahead.
Kalka. Brina.
Rydia reached up to inspect the ruby hyacinth in her hair, relieved that it had not shattered when she had been struck by the lightning. Turning to Kalka and Brina, she bowed her head.
Thanks, you two. You were kinder to us than we ever deserved.
Luca gathered their broken bodies in her arms, pressing her lips to Brina's matted, half-melted hair.
I'm going to repair you. I promise.
The 2 girls wordlessly exited the cavern that 4 had originally entered, and made their way aboard the Falcon. Luca set Kalka and Brina down on the rear of the deck, and began to lap around all of the machinery, investigating it for sabotage. Rydia, who wouldn't know the difference between something being broken or not, sat down next to the dolls, silently combing her fingers through Kalka's hair, which had not been as destroyed as his sister's and was still able to be brushed. After a few moments, Luca let out a frustrated wail and shook her head. Rydia looked up at her, fearing for the worst.
The Falcon. Is it?
Luca crossed her arms over her chest.
That girl didn't even pretend to take us seriously.
Rydia blinked.
Hey.
Luca rested her hand on the Falcon's steering wheel, clenching her teeth.
She didn't lay so much as a finger on the Falcon. Oh.
Rydia looked down at her fingers entangled in Kalka's hair. Of course Luca would get more upset at the idea of someone not even bothering to challenge her versus the idea of someone actively trying to make her life hell. That was the dwarven way, after all, go big or go home. But she realized Luca was right, they weren't even a blip on the mysterious girl's radar.
Yeah. And she didn't kill us when she had the chance.
Luca slammed her fist down on the steering wheel, making Rydia jump.
So, it's not even worth her time to kill us.
Rydia couldn't help but let out an anxious, high-pitched giggle, it was all just so ridiculous. By entering the sealed cave on their own with their half-brained scheme, they had put far more effort into trying to kill themselves than their new enemy.
Haha, doesn't look like it.
Luca smirked at the sound of Rydia's awkward laughter. The only way they could combat this awful situation was with humor, and between the 2 of them, she thought they had at least plenty of that.
Well, we'll show her. Let's make our way to the overworld. Are you ready to go, Rydia? I'm ready,
Rydia said, rising to her feet.
We still have 4 crystals left, and there are far more of our allies than there are of her. She's going to be sorry she ever messed with us. Hell yeah.
Luca cheered, slapping Rydia a high five.
Man your battle stations, time for liftoff.
Luca fired up the Falcon's engines, and Rydia felt the familiar rumble of the ship's gears engaging as they began to lift off the ground. Clinging to a mast beneath one of the sails, Rydia watched as the entrance to the sealed cave became smaller and smaller, until it was just a little black dot in a sea of magma. As they sailed over King Jot's castle, Rydia gave a silent farewell wave, glancing down at Kalka and Brina and letting a small smile form on her lips. When she thought about how Cecil would react to seeing them again, she wondered if she would get a rare glimpse of him dropping his normally unflappable persona. Since the last time he had encountered the dolls, they were much scarier. When they emerged from the gateway to the underworld, Rydia was surprised to see that twilight was already starting to claim the early summer sky. She had always lost track of time when she was underground, and today was no exception. The burgeoning smile on her lips faltered as she caught a glimpse at the twin moons, the new arrival now brighter and bigger than ever. Rydia stared up at the sky in dread, her hair tangling in the wind as she took a hesitant step forward to get a better view beyond the Falcon's sails. A shiver ran through her body, and she hugged herself, digging her fingernails into her arms to try to pinch herself awake. But when she closed her eyes and opened them again, the second moon was still there, of course. She hadn't entirely expected it to disappear while she was away from home, but for it to grow so large in so short a time. Did that mean it was getting closer? Rydia glanced over at Luca, who was paying no mind to anything but the route laid out before her. To Luca, 1 moon or 2 made no difference, they dealt with no such phenomenon in the underworld.
Luca, what is our next course of action?
She replied without turning her head.
We'll proceed south until we reach the northern coast of Baron. They won't expect us to sneak in from the rear.
Rydia nodded to herself, turning to glance out the side of the ship once more. She wasn't exactly thrilled at the prospect of sneaking into Baron, that implied that they were not going to be welcome, which she prayed was not the case. Cecil. We're coming as fast as we can. You'll have an explanation for all of this, right? It was a few minutes later that Rydia saw the strangely shaped shadow cutting across the ocean on starboard. Stepping closer to the railing, Rydia narrowed her eyes and pointed.
Luca. What's that over there?
Luca turned toward Rydia, reaching into her pouch and pulling out a scope. After a few moments, she lowered it, blinking.
A black chocobo. And the person riding it is a friend of ours. Take a look, I need to keep my eyes peeled with it starting to get dark.
She tossed the scope to Rydia, who caught it one-handed and raising it to her eye. Sure enough, Luca was right, but it wasn't just one person riding, there were 2. The person in the rear was a young woman with ash blonde hair pulled back into a ponytail, dressed in a seafoam green mitre and layers of elegant lace and silk robes that fluttered in the wind. The man in front of her looked to be a similar age, with a long brown braid that whipped like a banner, the girl crouching behind him with her hands wrapped around his chest to keep from getting hit. His dark blue overcoat was draped over a familiar green and white striped romper.
Palom.
Rydia blinked. Luca nodded, her voice suddenly dipping dangerously low.
And that's not Porum, whoever it is with him.
Rydia lowered the scope.
No. It did look like a girl, though.
She looked at Luca, who was visibly clenching all over and hunching her shoulders as she made a harsher turn than was necessary on the wheel.
Ooh, that sneak. After all that sweet talk he gave me. Sweet talk.
Rydia blanched.
Please don't tell me there has been sweet talk as of late. There might have been a little more than sweet talk. Oh gods.
Rydia felt her stomach churn and collapsed the scope between her hands.
I thought this little crush was dead in the water. Oh, it's dead now, I assure you.
Luca growled, and Rydia shook her head. At least Luca hadn't turned the ship around to follow him, she supposed that was some sort of progress. It wasn't that Rydia hated Palom, she reserved the feeling of hatred for a very select few individuals that had crossed her path over her lifetime. But as she had watched him grow up from a bratty child to sulky teen and finally to entitled young adult, she knew that he would never be compatible with someone as noble and spirited as Luca, who demanded respect for her mind and her actions, and not for her title, which was the polar opposite of how Palom operated. From afar, this was easy for Rydia to see, but she supposed for someone like Luca, who had grown up alongside Palom and had stumbled through adolescence together with him, the lines of logic and reason were blurrier. Luca had had a crush on Palom since the first day he barreled up to her to flirt at Cecil's wedding, and although the infatuation had been cute when they were kids, as they had gotten older it became much more drama-filled and are-they/aren't-they for Rydia's taste, especially as Luca began to take on more royal duties and Palom began to buckle down on his training to become a sage. The lecture Rydia was mentally preparing for Luca was interrupted when she heard a frantic scraping coming from the rear of the ship. Turning around, she let out a cry of delight when she saw Calca and Brina standing up, looking around curiously. Calca looked down at the hole in his chest, absent-mindedly sticking a finger through it, and Brina's head tilt was even more enunciated than usual because part of her hair had melted to her shoulder. Luca had heard the commotion as well, shifting a lever to put the ship on autopilot and joining Rydia. When she saw the dolls up and about, she jumped up and down excitedly, letting out whoops of joy.
Calca! Brina! Oh, thank goodness! I'm so glad you're not hurt!
Rydia exclaimed. She kneeled down to give Calca a big hug, but the doll made a strange hissing noise, reaching for his belt and extracting his knife. Luca yanked Rydia away just as Calca swiftly brought the blade down, lodging it into the Falcon's deck instead of her shoulder. Rydia screamed as she crawled backwards, and Luca provided cover, reaching into her tool belt to pull out her weapon.
Calca! Brina!
Rydia gasped. Brina followed her brother's lead, pulling out her own knife and clumsily throwing herself at Luca, who easily deflected the strike with her tomahawk and sent her flying into a chest of first aid supplies.
Stop it! Both of you!
Luca shrieked, but Brina merely picked herself back up again and readied herself for another attack, her head jerking unnervingly as she tried to focus her gaze. One of her glass eyes had been shattered when Luca fought her off and was now just a black pit with wires hanging out. A loud popping noise burst from Calca's chest as he stumbled forward, waving his knife erratically. Rydia reached for her ice rod, not being able to bear keeping her eyes open as she swung at Calca and felt the rod crack against the side of his head. When she cocked open one eye, she saw him splayed on the deck, the sputtering and popping getting louder as his body jerked uncontrollably.
That lightning strike!
Rydia whimpered.
Their behavior circuits must have gone haywire.
Luca shook her head.
I don't understand how they could possibly be moving. I thought they were totally fried. Luca, we can't keep this up.
Rydia had scrambled to her feet just in time to shake off Brina, who had abandoned her knife but had dived forward in an attempt to throttle Rydia, only managing to grab hold of her thigh instead. Rydia forcefully kicked Brina off, and lifted her leg to plant her boot square into the doll's chest.
Don't lay a finger on them, Rydia,
Luca warned, and Rydia paused, her leg in midair as Brina writhed underneath her.
What?
Luca looked down, clenching her jaw.
Trust me, okay? Just let me deal with them. Do you have an idea?
Rydia asked, reluctantly backing away from Brina. The doll took the opportunity to slither away, pressing her hands down on Calca's back and glowing with a soft green light as she cast a cure spell on him. Luca swallowed and approached the two dolls, lifting her tomahawk in the air as Calca and Brina both turned to look up at her, twin sneers curling on their lips. Their blue eyes had turned an alarming, glowing red, and smoke had begun to drift out of the wounds on their chests.
I'm sorry,
Luca said softly, and swung the tomahawk in a wide arch, slicing cleanly through the dolls' necks and watching wordlessly as their heads crashed to the floor in tandem with one dull thump. Their lifeless bodies followed, crashing to the deck while the heads rolled away aimlessly, finally coming to a stop when they hit one of the deck's railings.
Brina's good.
I had snapped shut, but both of Calca's were still wide open, staring into the abyss unblinking and back to their original calming blue. Both Calca and Brina's mouths were hanging open, as if they had been struck mid-scream. Rydia looked away from the decapitated heads as a wave of nausea washed over her, pressing her hand to her chest.
Luca!
Luca dropped her tomahawk, falling to her knees and covering her face with her hands as her body wretched with silent sobs. Rydia bit her lip and turned away, letting her have what little privacy could be managed on an airship mid-flight, and slowly walked over to the steering wheel, gazing out into the horizon. She could see the familiar outline of the mountain range that acted as the northern barrier for mist, which meant they would soon be over Barren. Rydia lowered her head, whispering a quick prayer for her fellow villagers. She wondered if anyone would see their ship as they flew over and know that it was her. She hadn't told anyone where she was going except the village chief, and she hadn't said when she would return. Deep in the recesses of her hidden heart, she had secretly hoped Azura and Leviathan would change their minds and tell her she could stay in the Fey March again, this time for as long as she wanted. Rydia stumbled as a sudden blast was let off, the proximity close enough to cause the falcon to shudder. Rydia, who was still holding onto the scope Luca had lent her, pried it back open, held it back up to her eye to see what had made the noise, although darkness was falling fast and making it nearly impossible to see. An eruption of red light and smoke greeted her, and Rydia realized it was coming from another airship. Moments later, there was a deafening crash, and Rydia was knocked to the deck, the scope clattering out of her hands and rolling away.
Cannon fire!
Rydia screeched.
Luca!
Another blast quickly followed, and Rydia watched with rising panic as the cannonball soared high above her head, smashing into the tops of several masts that came splintering down to the deck and tearing through a sail. Luca sat wordlessly as debris rained down upon her, still staring at the inanimate bodies of Kalka and Brina. Rydia used the steering wheel to pull herself back up, shouting back to Luca desperately.
It's the Red Wings. They're trying to shoot us down.
When Luca gave no reply, Rydia turned back to the control deck, trying to figure out the quickest way to get them away from Baron. A navigation system was lit up, with a dotted red line pointed toward Baron's location on a map. Next to it was a lever that had only 2 settings listed that were obvious to Rydia, autopilot, and manual. Grasping the clutch, Rydia shifted the lever down to manual, and the red dotted line pointing to Baron turned blue. Taking hold of the steering wheel, Rydia used every last ounce of strength she had to turn it as hard as she could to the left, hoping she could swing a wide enough trajectory that would not only get her away from Baron, but also from mist. If the Red Wings continued their assault over the village, innocent people could be caught right in the middle of the crossfire. Rydia gritted her teeth and kept one eye on the map, watching as the blue line slowly inched away from Baron, and started pointing toward the middle of an ocean instead. Now that they were flying away from their assailants, the next cannon that shot out at them struck the Falcon in the rear, and Rydia felt the ship drop dramatically, her heart leaping into her throat from the sudden loss in altitude. She tried pulling another lever that she thought might grant them some lift, but heard a sickening grinding noise coming from behind. The cannon must have damaged a rotor, or perhaps several, by the way sparks were flying down from above.
I can't keep us in the air anymore!
Rydia screamed. All she could see on the map was a sea of blue, and realized that at any moment, they were probably going to crash into the ocean and drown. Suddenly, Luca appeared behind her, gently taking Rydia's shoulder and shoving her aside.
Emergency landing time!
Luca took hold of the wheel, giving it one last twist with far less effort than Rydia had to make.
Hold on to me!
Rydia grabbed onto Luca's waist, closing her eyes as she felt them drop faster and faster in the sky, another explosion echoing behind them before everything went black.
NNNGH.
Rydia opened her eyes, just the effort of moving her eyelids feeling as if she had 5-ton weights attached to her eyelashes. She found herself splayed on the deck of the Falcon, about a dozen feet away from where she had started at the steering wheel. The sky had not gotten too much darker, so surely that meant she had only been out for a little while. Agonizingly, she climbed to her feet, trying to ignore the protests of all the muscles in her body as she put her hands on her hips and took a look at her surroundings. For starters, they weren't in the ocean, a very good thing. They were on a beach, and even in the fast-fading light, Rydia could see a cluster of houses and buildings not so far away. Miraculously, Luca had managed to crash-land them next to civilization. Further away, Rydia could also make out a mountain range, although it didn't look very big from where she was standing. Hey. So where did we end up? Some sort of island with mountains. Definitely not barren or mist.
Luca!
Rydia called out.
Kirk!
A low moan came from underneath a pile of collapsed sails. Rydia ran to the sails, tossing away the heavy canvas until she spotted her friend lying face down, the goggles that had been resting on her head shattered.
Luca!
Luca shook her head, standing up as she reached up and plucked the broken goggles away from her face, grimacing before tossing them overboard onto the beach.
I'm okay. That happened before we crashed. Something hit my face as we were going down.
They both turned to see what had become of Kalka and Brina. Miraculously, all of their parts were still present and accounted for, not that it changed anything that had happened before they went down. Luca pressed her lips together, shaking her head. The light had still not yet returned to her eyes, they were 2 dull orbs of gold, void of their former luster.
Kalka? Brina? I'm sorry.
Rydia looked up her friend worriedly, was she going to break down again?
Luca.
Luca turned back to Rydia, crossing her arms over her chest and ready for a change of subject, although it was no less dire.
I can tell you right now that we took some serious damage.
Rydia tucked her hair behind her ear anxiously.
Do you think we can fix it?
Luca looked down, not saying anything. Rydia frowned. Luca. We've gotten this far. We can't give up now. You didn't give up on me. I guess it's time for drastic measures. Rydia puffed out her chest, putting her hands on her hips and trying bellow in a baritone as she widened her stance.
Just who do you think I am?
Luca looked up, her mouth twisted in confusion as she furrowed her brows.
Duh.
Rydia forced out a deep belly laugh and waggled her finger.
I'm Sid the airship man, that's what they call me. Just let me at that thing. I'll get her back up in a jiffy. That's what your master would be saying right about now, isn't it?
Luca stared at Rydia for a few beats before bursting out laughing so hard that she had to clutch her stomach.
You're right.
Rydia smiled widely, smacking Luca on the back.
See? There you go. That's the spirit. You can fix anything, and I'll be your assistant.
Luca nodded, snapping her fingers.
We'll need to find some parts for the repairs first. Maybe someone in town can help us. Do you know where we are?
Rydia blinked.
Sure do.
Luca pointed toward the mountain Rydia had spotted earlier.
That happens to be the entrance to the underworld. In other words, we're kinda back right where we started.
Rydia tilted her head.
So? ARandomAudiobookAppeared, then.
Luca nodded, and Rydia pushed up on her tiptoes to peer over Luca's shoulder toward the village. She could see that a few villagers had gathered at the gates, curious about the spectacle that had crashed on their beach. As far as Rydia was concerned, anywhere was better than Baron right now, revelers and all.
All right, let's go.
They made their way into town, and although some of the gossips had fled the premises, plenty of people remained behind, eager to greet their new visitors and get a first-hand account of the drama. But as soon as they saw that one of their two visitors was a dwarf, chaos erupted.
Whoa!
A little girl shrieked, jumping up and down and pointing to Luca.
Look mommy, one of our ancestors.
Several other children began to join her, chanting and dithering about.
Ancestor?
Luca blinked.
I'm only 21, kid. Oh, she means you're a dwarf,
the child's mother said, blushing.
Are you from the underworld? Welcome to ARandomAudiobookAppeared. It's so rare that we get visits from any of the ancestors, this is such a treat.
The children began to swarm Luca, grabbing her clothes and slinging questions at her from all directions.
Do all dwarves wear pink? Why are you so tan? When are you going to get your beard? Where's your giant axe?
My stars. Rydia blinked. I've been traveling with a celebrity this whole time. It took all of her willpower not to burst out laughing. Luca scowled and tried to pull a child off of her who had literally begun to climb up her leg, but Rydia could tell she was secretly pleased at their fawning.
The answers are, 1, no, pink isn't very popular down there 2, this is the skin I was born with 3, probably not until I'm much older and 4, you should only use your axe for battle, safety first.
The children squealed, and another parent stepped into the fray, shaking his head.
Come on, leave them alone.
He glanced up at the girls apologetically.
You're the ones from the crash, right? Is everyone okay? Yes, thank you,
Rydia nodded.
But we need help repairing our ship. Do you know anyone that could help us find parts? Oh, sure,
the man smiled.
My best friend is over at the ARandomAudiobookAppeared Inn right now having supper, he's a miner that works with a pilot from Baron, well, calling him just a pilot is a bit of a disservice, he's actually the guy who invented the airship, if you can believe it. Sid Polendina is his name. No kidding.
Luca raised her eyebrows.
Is Sid here now? No, he only comes around once in a blue moon for parts, but I'm sure my friend will know exactly what you need, he's worked with Sid for a long time. Thank you so much.
Rydia exclaimed.
We'll go over there right now. It's the biggest building in town in the northeast. You can't miss it. Thanks,
Luca nodded, and they took off, laughing to themselves as parents had to physically restrain their children from following them.
Our luck is really turning around,
Rydia smiled, and Luca smiled back.
Yeah. Too bad Sid wasn't here. That would have just been perfect. But I can do this on my own.
The ARandomAudiobookAppeared Inn was practically bursting at the seams when they arrived. Every single table was overcrowded with people, and waitresses were rushing back and forth with platters of food high above their heads, shouting behind you as they crossed each other's paths. Luca and Rydia looked at each other, dismayed.
How the heck are we supposed to find this guy?
Luca pouted.
We should ask the innkeeper,
Rydia offered.
This is a small town, I'm sure he knows everyone if this place is always busy.
The innkeeper, however, was seemingly quite a star himself, with a long line of people who were waiting to be penciled in for a table or who were just chatting about their day. Luca and Rydia got to the end of the line, shrugging at each other as if to say,
"What are you going to do?"
Other people in the inn had started to notice Luca, and soon steady streams of people were coming up to her as well, welcoming her to ARandomAudiobookAppeared and prodding her for information about the underworld, all of which she cheerfully answered, to her credit. Rydia, totally forgotten thanks to her boring summoner heritage, took the opportunity to do a little eavesdropping. One thing she had learned from her travels around the world during the war was that small towns were always ripe for good gossip. As the line inched forward, Rydia got closer to a four-top table that was squashing in 6 diners. None of them appeared to be minors, but they were having some sort of celebration.
"Thank the gods you made it home safely,"
one of the women said, raising her wine glass. The others cheered and clinked their glasses together.
"What was Baron like?"
a man asked.
"The village is surprisingly small for such a powerful nation,"
the man sitting in the center of the table replied.
"It's a lot like ARandomAudiobookAppeared where you know your neighbors, but so many people there live in the castle, too. Students of magic, most of their military. The elite of the elite. But everyone there was very kind to me." "So the rumors about Baron collecting the crystals, are they true?"
Rydia drew in a sharp breath, hoping that she wasn't so loud that it was obvious what she was doing. But no one else was paying attention to her.
"I really don't know. That's news to me. The last thing I heard was that the prince was readying for his trial to join the Red Wings, heard a couple of kids talking about it at the docks. Sounds like it had the castle in a tizzy. It was unexpected." "Unexpected? Now that's interesting."
"See a door." Rydia pressed her hand to her mouth. "He suddenly joined the Red Wings? Does that mean?" She replayed the memory of the majestic crimson ship that had made its way over Jot's castle before attempting to vomit into oblivion. "No. Jot said they were only attacked by one person, the mysterious girl who stole the crystal from us. But if she is in control of a Red Wings ship, then what happened to Theodore?"
"Can I help you, ma'am?"
Rydia whirled around, and found herself facing the check-in desk, next in line. The innkeeper was smiling at her patiently, his hand holding a feather quill that had already been dipped in ink.
"Oh. I don't need a reservation,"
Rydia laughed nervously, feeling the blush crawl up her cheek. She couldn't help but feel a little guilty that she had been caught spying on someone's conversation, even if it had been innocent.
"I just need help finding a man. We don't have a name, but we were told he'd be here. He's a miner that helps get airship parts for Sid Polendina." "Oh. You're looking for some?"
The innkeeper leaned over the counter, pointing to a man in a denim shop suit, sitting alone at a table with a blackened bag of gear sitting in the one chair next to him.
"Thank you,"
Rydia nodded quickly, dragging Luca away from her fan club much to the protest of the people who had come over to chat with her. Sam looked up from his massive drink when Rydia and Luca approached him, smiling as he leaned back in his chair. Up close, Rydia could see the pale rings around his eyes where his goggles had been sitting. The rest of his skin was peppered in fine, black dust.
"Well. It's not every day that 2 ladies as beautiful as you come to my table. What can I do for you?" "Our airship needs parts for repairs, and we were told you would know where to get some,"
Luca said, cutting straight to business. Sam raised his eyebrows, popping back up so that he was sitting up straight. Something about the way Luca's regal voice sounded when she wanted something made people remember their manners.
"What sorts of problems are you having?"
Sam asked. Rydia couldn't help but tune out as Luca went into a thorough description of everything she had noticed was wrong, rattling off the names of engine components that Rydia couldn't spell, let alone identify. When she was finished, he nodded and took a long sip of his beer.
"Sounds like the best course of action is to melt down some agartite. It's an ore that should patch up those damaged parts with no issue, and hold up to the heat of the underworld when you return home." "Agartite?"
Luca crossed her arms over her chest.
Never heard of that. Where can I get it? I just salvaged some myself at the mine down the way,
Sam replied.
The one in Mount Agart that opened about 7 years ago. I can get it for you tomorrow if you would like. It's an emergency,
Luca frowned.
Is there any problem with going tonight? No problem except that I'm getting well past plastered because my shift ended several hours ago,
Sam laughed.
But if you two want to go in my stead, have at it. I'll even let you borrow some of my gear.
He reached over, untying the knapsack he had on his chair and plucking out 2 leather straps with glass headlamps attached to them.
You'll have to wear these, it's too dark to see in there even during the day, and will be pitch black at this time of night. If you need them, there are picks right at the entrance of the mine. You'll be looking for rocks with a dusty red sheen. I didn't have a chance to refine any that I found, so once you find them, you'll need to chip away with the pick until you see red crystal. That's the stuff you want to melt down.
Thank you, Luca said, picking up the headgear and handing one to Rydia.
Anything else we should know? Just be careful. No one is going to be back there until tomorrow morning.
They nodded, thanking him one more time and making their way out of the inn. A man who had been sitting at the table next door leaned over, letting out a loud hiccup.
Sam, please tell me you just did not tell those 2 ladies to go into the Agard mine alone, at night? They needed agartite,
Sam shrugged, taking another sip.
Isn't a little sexist to assume that they can't handle themselves just because they're women? I never said anything of the sort, you moron, but did you remember what phase of the moon it is? Waning. Right. Right. And what has a tendency to crawl out of the volcano on nights of the waning moon and go wandering around for a snack?
Sam paused for a moment, staring into his beer as if it would magically reveal the answer. Suddenly, it hit him, and he nervously set his glass down.
Ah. I'm sure they'll be fine. They'll probably be in and out before it even wakes up. It's still a little early, yet.
Rydia gazed up at the waning moon as they crossed the field to the Agard mine. The headlamp strapped to her forehead felt heavy against her scalp and made her sweat, but she knew she would be grateful for it momentarily. The light of the twin moons wasn't going to reach them where they were going. Luca lumbered a few steps behind with her tomahawk clutched in her fist, keeping an eye out for any monsters that might try to take them for lost travelers and attack. Rydia found herself still shaken by the breakdown she had witnessed after Luca had finished off Kalka and Brina. Luca had certainly done a good job of putting up a cheerful front while in Agard, but Rydia saw her steal a longing glance at the falcon as they left the village bounds, and she knew the princess was still torturing herself over the fate of her childhood friends. Rydia had never seen Luca so troubled, yet she was flattered that Luca had thought nothing of exposing her most vulnerable self to her. She had trusted Rydia implicitly with her heartbreak. It made Rydia realize that as painful as it was, she needed to finally be honest with Luca too. If Luca could entrust Rydia with her weaknesses, then Rydia felt obligated to do the same. She was tired of feeling like she had to hide the insecurities that made her human. She wasn't in the Feymarch anymore, after all.
Luca.
Rydia began as they crossed into the entrance of the Agard mine. Both girls clicked on their helmets at the same time, and twin beams of light shot out in front of them, illuminating a dreary, dirt-filled and rock dust-covered path that took a rather sudden dip not too far in. They would have to see what was waiting for them below once they were closer. As was promised by Sam, there was a chest of picks abandoned just east of the entrance, and Luca plucked 2 from the pile, handing one to Rydia. Rydia shoved it between her belt and her hip bone.
What's up?
Luca asked. She made a point of not turning toward Rydia as to not blind her with the headlamp, and instead started to move forward into the passageway.
Do you remember the last time we went to the Feymarch together a few years ago? It was you, me, Sid and the twins. Oh, how could I forget?
Luca asked dreamily.
When you guys came to visit and Palom was with you, it became the best day of my year.
Rydia made a face that she was glad Luca couldn't see. It seemed that Luca was already overseeing Palom with another girl. Not that he had necessarily been doing anything wrong, but Rydia had been pleased that for at least a little while, it seemed like Luca was starting to wise up about her poor taste in men.
Well, I'm afraid I led Palom there under false pretenses. He wanted to train, but I had just wanted an excuse to return to the Feymarch. I was banished from there shortly after Theodore was born. Way-ay-ay-ay-ot.
Rydia blinked as Luca's form suddenly disappeared in front of her. Jogging to catch up, she saw that Luca had reached the dip in the tunnel she had spied when they first entered the mine, and had tumbled down a makeshift slide into the depths below. Rydia kneeled down and tried to shine her headlamp to where Luca had fallen. She spotted a groaning bubblegum pink heap about 30 feet below.
"Are you okay?"
Rydia shouted. She saw Luca's hand shakily jut out from underneath her form and give a thumbs up. Rydia nodded, climbing back to her feet.
"I'm coming down."
Glancing to her right, she saw that just a few steps away was a stairway carved in the stone floor of the mine. When she reached the bottom of the steps, she found Luca pulling herself up and cursing under her breath as she brushed black dust off her jacket.
"Watch where you're going next time,"
Rydia chided gently.
"They probably used that slide to send down heavy tools."
Luca arched an eyebrow as she rubbed her glove across her cheek, which just smeared the dust across her skin rather than clear it off.
"Sorry, I was paying too much attention to your little confession. What the hell did you do to get banned from the Feymarch? And does that mean the entire time you were planning your latest trip you were still banished?"
"Yes," Rydia looked down.
"The last time I went back there with you, Sid and the twins, Azura really let me have it, and practically tossed me out on my rear. That was why we didn't stay very long. Despite all that, I schemed to return again someday, and my resolve solidified with the appearance of the second moon. I'm sorry for dragging you into what became a horrible situation. King Leviathan and Queen Azura would not have laid blame on you, of course, but I still asked you to aid me with something that went against their wishes, and that was disrespectful. PSHH, it's not their wishes I care about."
Luca shook her head.
"I'm your friend, you need to go somewhere or get something done, I wanna be the person you can rely on. But seriously, what happened that made Azura kick you out?"
Rydia felt a smile begin to tug on the corners of her lips despite the ache in her heart. Walking side by side this time, the girls plunged deeper into the mine.
"Queen Azura thought it was best that as a human, I be among other humans again,"
Rydia began.
"At first, everyone seemed happy with me living in the Feymarch after the war had ended. But I started to see the cracks in the veneer when I left the Feymarch to attend Edward's celebration in Damcyan. Before I departed, Azura told me she thought it would be best if perhaps I returned to the human world permanently. I think she could see how excited I was to be with the others, but I told her the Feymarch was every bit my home as the surface world, and she dropped the subject. And that's when your doppelganger paid us all a visit."
Luca nodded.
"I remember stealing the falcon to try to find Cecil. Oof, father grounded me for weeks."
Rydia clutched her ice rod tighter in her hands. She had to physically brace herself to get through what had happened next.
"The morning after we had gathered in Baron to debrief about my imposter, I went back home to the Feymarch. And even though nothing bad had happened there while I was gone, Azura started acting weirder and weirder. She would start to go quiet when I entered a room, or worse yet, would ask that I would leave when she held important meetings with the other Eidolons, something she had never made me do before. Leviathan kept being his usual kind self, but we both know who rules the roost there."
Luca let out a sarcastic bark of laughter.
"Yep. So I made an extra careful effort not to leave the Feymarch unless absolutely necessary. I wanted to try to prove to Azura that I did belong there, and that I didn't need the human world as badly as she thought I did. But then I had a dream about Theodore's birth, and I decided to visit Cecil and Rosa to congratulate them. I wanted a fresh start, to reverse the deterioration of my friendships from the war. I realized that I had been through something both agonizing and extraordinary with Cecil, Rosa, Kane, and Edge. We had become bound by fate. And I missed them." "Rydia."
Luca frowned.
"Were you that lonely that whole time in the Feymarch?" "I was. And I know now that Queen Azura understood that long before I could even recognize it within myself. When I came home from meeting Theodore, it was the beginning of the end. It was only a few weeks after that she sent me away. I had nowhere else to go, so I threw myself into the restoration of mist and settled there. As the years went on, I tried to keep up with the others, and be a good honorary aunt for Theodore. But I still didn't feel like I entirely belonged, which I suppose remains true even today."
Rydia reached up, dragging a fist over her tearing eyes.
"What about Edge?"
Luca blinked.
"He helped you restore mist, right? I thought he really cared for you, but you haven't seen him since the restoration completed. You never talk about him."
Rydia nodded slowly. She knew that question was coming.
"Edge and I. It was just never the right time. Whatever he thought we were fated to be. It just didn't work out. I took one route, and he took another, the wind blowing at both our backs."
Luca snorted.
"What is that supposed to mean?" That's exactly when you take fate into your own hands.
Rydia gave a small smile through her tears.
Someday, you will understand. You'll have many things in your life that you feel are important to you, but when the time comes for you to make a decision about what is most important, your heart will become the compass that leads you down the right route. Even if it doesn't feel good at the time.
Luca looked down, kicking away a large rock and sending it violently bouncing down the tunnel.
Maybe I know what you mean a little.
Rydia bit down on her lip. Of course. Kalka and Brina.
Clack.
Rydia and Luca's heads both suddenly shot up, their headlamps washing over a large pile of crates that was scattered against what appeared to be a dead end, or at least where the miners had stopped digging for the day. The rock Luca had kicked had bounced into one of the crates, causing it to rupture with a crack shooting up one of its sides.
Irk.
Luca blushed.
Sometimes I forget my own strength. Never mind that.
Rydia gasped excitedly.
This must be where the Agartite is.
She ran over to the crates and pried one open with her pick, starting to sort through the piles of rock within. Luca followed her, tilting her head so that her light shined upon the pile Rydia was sorting through.
Remember, we're looking for a rock that has a dusty red sheen underneath,
Luca recalled.
Purple. Blue. Green.
Rydia sighed as she dove deeper into the crate.
There's every color here but red. Keep looking,
Luca encouraged.
We didn't come all this way just to leave empty-handed. I'll start digging through the mine myself if we have to.
With the commotion Rydia was making shifting the rocks in the crate in front of her, neither of them noticed the soft grumbles emitting from beneath the other crates in the pile. It was only one of the top crates suddenly shifted that Rydia and Luca both looked up, mouths agape.
What was that? Luca, did you kick another rock? Obviously not, I've been right here the whole time. MRRRRGRRRR. Look out.
Rydia cried, diving forward and pushing Luca out of the way just before the top crate came crashing down upon them, the wood exploding into splintered pieces with rocks spilling everywhere. Luca and Rydia tumbled into the depressed wall of the mine, watching with wide eyes as more crates began to quiver and fall, the entire stack collapsing in on itself like a set of dominoes.
An earthquake?
Luca cried.
I don't think so.
Rydia gasped.
Look.
She turned her head, flashing her headlamp on a gleaming black eye that was staring at them between a set of crates. A pair of scaly, dusky blue reptile legs was exposed from the fallen crates, each attached to a massive spiked shell. The front left leg slammed at the crate in front of it, revealing that the eye belonged to a tortoise's head that was the size of a chocobo's entire trunk. Snapping its jaw of knife-like teeth, the tortoise tore into a nearby crate, instantly crushing it between its teeth and burrowing through the rocks within, taking care to seek out only certain ones and pulverizing them with its maw before swallowing. It slowly hauled itself up and over the crates beneath, some of them collapsing instantaneously under its weight. As it chewed through the crates, its skin and shell mutated from blue to red, and their headlamps revealed that steam was starting to pour from the openings in the shell where its limbs and head stuck out.
That thing is eating our Agartite.
Luca stammered.
Unbelievable.
The tortoise let out a gassy belch, a tongue of flame spilling from its mouth like a super-powered blowtorch. The discharge set some of the crates on fire, and Rydia and Luca watched with dismay as the rocks within the crates began to transform from the chemical reaction ignited by being doused with flame, turning into a dripping red mess that bled all over the cavern floor.
No.
Rydia cried.
If we don't stop it, all the ore will be melted down before we're able to take it to the ship.
She stumbled to her feet, raising her ice rod. This time, I'll save us, Luca.
Rydia, no.
Luca hissed.
It's going to try to light us on fire next.
The tortoise swung its head toward Rydia, parting its jaw and readying to unleash another fiery explosion. Rydia closed her eyes, channeling all of her strength into sculpting a towering spire of ice in her mind's eye and willing it to flow through her fingertips into the rod held high over her head. She felt the metallic handle of the rod get so cold that it stung her flesh to keep holding on, but she wouldn't let herself relinquish to the pain. Luca watched in awe as the ice crystal atop Rydia's rod began to glow bright blue, drifts of snowflakes dancing through the air and surrounding Rydia's form as the temperature of the cavern dropped several degrees in a matter of seconds. Rydia's eyes snapped open, and she brought the rod down just as the tortoise spewed out another torrent of flame.
Blizzaga!
The snowflakes that had been encircling Rydia flew in front of her body, erecting a shield that the flame came barreling into with a loud hiss of steam that resonated throughout the cavern. Underneath the tortoise, a lotus-shaped collective of ice crystals began to explode upward, impaling the beast's soft underbelly and tearing through the glowing red shell with a sickening crack. The tortoise reared back, swaying its head as it collapsed on top of the crates that had been lit on fire, instantly snuffing out the flames with its ice-encased body. A few moments later, there was an eruption of silvery dust, and the tortoise was no more. Rydia inhaled deeply, a smile curling over her lips.
"You're insane,"
Luca cried, running over to her and slapping her on the back.
"But also, a genius, and I love it. You look like some kind of ice goddess. Kind of like Shiva. Yeah. Shiva would be proud if she could see you right now."
Rydia clutched the rod to her chest, smiling deeper. For the first time since returning to the Feymarch, she did not feel compelled to cry at the thought of her lost friends.
"Thank you. Hopefully she can see me, wherever she is."
Luca waltzed over to the crates they hadn't been able to reach that the tortoise had been rummaging in. Sure enough, she found several ores of agartite that were still intact, saved by Rydia's ice storm. Gently tapping them with her pick, she scraped away the raw black volcanic rock the ore was encased in, revealing a set of glimmering red crystals whose light reflected within her golden stare.
"I bet we can repair the falcon with this. Let's go back and try it." "Right."
Rydia nodded, and Luca took off so fast that Rydia thought she had wings strapped to her boots. As she started to follow, she noticed that her pick had fallen from when she had pushed Luca out of the way of the falling crates, and bent down to pick it up. As her headlamp swept over the cavern floor, she thought she saw a flash of silver near the rear of the crates, where the monster had emerged. Sticking the pick back into her belt, Rydia crawled over, scooping up the silver bits in her hand. They consisted of a nut, a bolt, and a tightly wound spring. "Looks like that tortoise was hoarding this trash." Rydia dropped the silver into the small pouch that hung from her belt. There was no point in leaving it for a miner to accidentally step on. Back on the Falcon, Rydia lit various lanterns with a fire spell so that they had light to work by, including the furnace in the broiler room that they were going to use as a makeshift refinery for the ore. Luca dragged out her toolbox, rubbing her hands excitedly.
"All right then. Time to get to work." "Let me help, too,"
Rydia added.
"Remember, I'm the assistant now."
After 2 straight hours of work, during which Rydia took a short break to run into Agard to get them dinner and to return Sam's equipment, Luca surfaced from another trip into the boiler room below deck, a scowl deeply etched into her features.
"This doesn't look good." "What is it?"
Rydia stood up from where she had been resting on a chest, shoving the last of her food into her mouth and swallowing hurriedly. Luca looked down.
"The damage is a lot worse than I thought. I can't fix it with what I have at hand. Even with the agartite. I need another alloy to replace one of the pistons in the engine."
Rydia put her hands on her hips.
"You're kidding me. If we can't get the Falcon back in shape, we'll be stuck here."
Luca snorted angrily.
"I know, okay."
Rydia looked down, shaking her head.
"Sorry, I didn't mean."
Luca held up her palm.
"No. I'm sorry."
She let out a tired sigh, and Rydia watched as she glanced over at the rear corner of the deck where they had set Kalka and Brina's remains to rest to keep them out of the way. Rydia blinked.
"Wait. You aren't thinking about salvaging the parts from Kalka and Brina's bodies, are you?"
Luca pushed her fingers through her sweat-drenched hair.
"I don't have any other choice. That's the only way for me to get the Falcon off the ground. We have to get to Baron somehow, right? I promised you."
Rydia stomped her foot, making Luca jump in surprise.
"Stop. You can't do that. Don't even think about it." "But you grew up with these guys. You've known them since childhood."
Luca looked away.
"I know that. But sometimes these kinds of choices have to be made, right? You said so yourself."
Rydia took a deep breath, desperately trying to think of something, anything, that could help them. Maybe Luca could melt down the rod Kokol had made before he passed? It was a beautiful weapon, but she was tired of being the reason why the people around her had to make sacrifices. As she reached down at her hip to take hold of the rod, her hand brushed over her pouch, and she remembered the trash she had found in the mine. Pulling out the bolt, nut, and spring, Rydia presented them to Luca.
Can't you use these?
Luca blinked, plucking the pieces from Rydia's hand and investigating them in the flickering light of the lanterns.
Rydia, where did you find this mithril? Mithril?
Rydia shook her head.
I thought it was just scrap metal.
Luca grinned.
This is perfect. Not just for the Falcon, but I can use these to fix Calca and Brina too. I don't need to build a new piston if I can secure the damaged one with a powerful alloy like this. And I can melt down the spring to attach Calca and Brina's bodies to their heads after I reprogram them.
Rydia clapped her hands together.
Really?
Luca nodded, throwing her arms around her.
Yes. Thank you, Rydia. Are you up for a few more hours of work?
Rydia laughed.
How could I possibly sleep after all this? The Falcon is back, baby.
Luca raised her hands in the air, waving them excitedly as she did a traditional dwarven dance that Rydia had only ever seen performed by drunken dwarves in pub howdy buried deep in the basement of Jot's castle.
And Calca and Brina, too.
Rydia added, giggling as the revived dolls ran up to join Luca, falling in step with her perfectly and finishing the set with a set of dramatic pirouettes. Luca had completed their programming, and Rydia had done her best to sew the holes in their clothes from where the lightning had struck them. And finally, as Luca was putting the finishing touches on the Falcon, Rydia had found a hairbrush and gently brushed through Brina's melted hair, pulling what was left of it into an elegant side-swept plate that hid the burned parts of her head and allowed her still-formed sausage curls to spiral down her shoulder.
You look beautiful, Brina.
Luca smiled, and Brina reached up, patting her braid proudly.
I guess playing with dolls is kind of fun,
Rydia giggled.
Maybe I wouldn't mind if I got one for my birthday. It's got to have hair, though. That's definitely the best part.
As they began to debate whether they should get some much-needed shut-eye in the hull of the ship or spring for beds at the ARandomAudiobookAppeared Inn, a tremor ran underneath the Falcon, causing the ship to rock back and forth as if they were on a rough sea. Calca and Brina clung onto each other, and Rydia steadied herself with the railing to look at their surroundings. Dawn's light was just beginning to emerge from the eastern horizon, turning the sands of the beach they had been stranded on a pale pink. Luca stepped up next to her, frowning.
Okay, this has got to be an earthquake, right? I don't see any giant tortoises around this time.
Rydia shook her head.
It doesn't seem natural. I'm getting a very odd feeling. Why is the ground shaking, but the ocean is totally still?
Another violent tremble rocked the ship as if to answer her, and in the far distance, emerging from the small forest of trees that flanked ARandomAudiobookAppeared village, was a massive figure with bronzed, oiled skin and violet hair that fell over his shoulders, matching the loincloth tied around his waist. With each step he took forward, the ground beneath his feet shuddered and buckled, and he was heading straight for ARandomAudiobookAppeared.
Titan!
Rydia gasped.
Oh my god! It's really him.
She turned to Luca, who was staring at the colossus of a man confusedly.
He's an Eidolon.
Titan lifted his head, looking around for a moment before turning away and continuing his journey. Rydia shook her head, preparing to leap from the ship.
Wait. It's me. Rydia. Girl, calm down.
Luca cried, grabbing Rydia by the shoulders and facing her toward the ramp which Calca and Brina had already lowered for them.
You're not going to do anyone any good if you break your neck. Alright.
Rydia gasped.
Let's hurry. ARandomAudiobookAppeared is in mortal danger. We can't let Titan make his way in.
Rydia and Luca broke into a desperate run, sand spraying from underneath their feet as they crossed the beach to cut Titan off at the entrance to ARandomAudiobookAppeared. Despite not having slept for close to 24 hours now, the adrenaline pumping through Rydia's body made her feel like she could do anything, even lift Titan up and toss him in the ocean, if need be. Skidding to a stop in front of the Gigas, Rydia held out her hands, trying to get his attention.
Please. You've got to wake up.
Titan stared down at her wordlessly, with no sign of recognizance. His eyes were dull black rocks that were shriveled in his head, with nary a sign of life. Rydia shook her head, clenching her fists.
No.
Luca stumbled up to Rydia, gasping for air.
What's going on? He doesn't know who you are.
Rydia bit down on her lip.
He's under some kind of spell. There's no light in his eyes.
Luca looked away.
Oh, no.
She glanced up at the village gates, wondering if their next best plan would be for her to run through the streets, screaming for people to evacuate before it was too late. But where would they all go? They couldn't all fit in the Falcon.
Titan. Please.
Rydia fell to her knees before him, clasping her hands together.
Please, remember me. When Mommy died. You saved my life. Saved all of Mist. I was so happy when I finally got to meet you again in the Fame Arch, and enter into a true covenant. You've been with me since I was a little girl, surely, you know who I am.
Titan grasped the sides of his head, letting out a scream so powerful that all of the birds that had been nesting in the forest behind him screeched and erupted into flight, fleeing the island as fast as their wings would take them. Rydia grimaced and covered her ears, feeling like her eardrums were about to burst. A single tear slid down her cheek as she looked up to see the shadow of Titan's foot falling over her. She was paralyzed from his scream and couldn't bring herself to flee. Closing her eyes, she kept her hands clasped in prayer, the ringing in her ears drowning out the sound of Lucas' screams from behind her. The wet, stomach-turning sound of steel slicing through flesh erupted in the air, and Rydia cringed, waiting for her bones to be ground to dust. But when nothing happened, she slowly opened one eye, and then another. Titan was gone, and standing in his place was a towering man, well over 6 feet tall and someone who could have passed for a gigas himself. Dressed in only a flowing black cloak draped over his broad shoulders and a matching kilt that fell just above his knees, the rest of the man's tanned, sculpted form was unabashedly on full display, save for a set of crimson prayer beads adorning each of his ankles and his wrists. Rydia's eyes trailed down to his curved, black steel blade clutched in his grip, which was dripping with blood, and she knew right away that it was Titan's. Lucas' jaw was on the ground. The man in black had appeared from above as if he were an angel descending the heavens, plunging his blade into Titan's back and causing the Eidolon to disappear in a burst of sparkling green light just as his foot was about to crush Rydia's head. Rydia stood up shakily, regaining control of her body as the ringing in her ears receded.
Who are you?
The man turned away from her, gazing to the west. Silently, he pointed a finger toward the horizon.
We need to go. The tower awaits.
Rydia and Luca both turned toward where he was pointing, and let out simultaneous gasps.
The Tower of Babel.
Rydia whispered. In the clear dawn of the morning, they could see the deep, pulsing red of the tower lights, even though it was stationed all the way in Evelyn, a continent that was an entire ocean away. Rydia had not seen the tower glow this fiercely since 15 years ago, when her doppelganger had been awaiting her inside. And once more prior to that, when the path to the moon and opened during the war, setting the stage for the blue planet's decimation by Zemus. The man in black continued, staring toward the direction of the Tower of Babel, crossing his arms over his chest. A crisp morning sea breeze washed over the three of them. Rydia and Luca both shivered, but the man, hardly dressed in half as many clothes as either of them, didn't even flinch. His velvety, distant voice was barely discernible over the wind.
The horrors of the past come to visit us again.
Rydia and Luca turned away from the tower, the same dumbstruck look on their faces. Rydia dared to get a closer look at her savior while he was distracted by the tower's lights. Reflecting the early morning moonlight that still bathed the sky, the man's eyes were pools of deep violet, but were stained with such torment and sorrow that Rydia had to force herself to look away after only a few seconds. Looking at them felt the same as if she had caught him in a deeply private, vulnerable moment. And though she had never seen such eyes before, she would have remembered such a beautiful, almost majestic purple hue. There was something about them that was still so achingly familiar, so much so that she felt her heart skip a beat when she stole one last look. Whether her heart was reacting in fear or wonderment, she could not discern. Rydia shivered again, running her hands up and down her arms.
Who are you? Really?
The man in black turned to face her, his lips parted as if to speak. Another gust of wind blew through, tossing his dark silver hair over his face and obscuring his grievous stare. Rydia felt as if a chasm was going to open up beneath her at any second and swallow her into ceaseless darkness, and her heart began to palpitate fiercely. Fear. It was definitely fear. End of chapter.